Good evening, everyone. My name is Beth Austin, and I'm president of AAWE. We are very pleased to have gathered so many people this evening to hear from the Chargé d'Affaires, the Consul General, and the consular staff. We have an unusually large audience tonight, which includes members of the American Club, the AWG American Women's Group, and the American Catholic Women's Organization. They're co-sponsoring, of course, with AARO. The group is so large, in fact, we were not able to register everyone who replied. But we hope because of the strong interest that we'll be able to do a similar event in the near future. In terms of AWE, we are 60 years young this year. We are celebrating this year 60 years of a long history of advocacy, of outreach to our local and wider communities, of friendship, of support, and of a wonderful network for women leading bicultural lives in France. We welcome anyone who is here tonight who would like to know more about us to go onto our website, and we'd be glad to speak with any of you about joining us. Now I'd like to introduce William Jordan, who is the president of the other club co-sponsoring tonight, AARO. William?
Thanks a lot, Beth, and thank you, AAWE, for working with AARO to bring this event together. The people who have organized this really deserve everybody's a round of applause from everybody. As always, I say in these events these days that I'm very sorry we're not doing this in person, that we're unable to get together as we traditionally would have done for this kind of a session. Although I suppose one of the good things is that we may be reaching a lot more people this way than we would have in a real life event. Throughout the pandemic, one of the things that has struck me that has been critical for Americans overseas, not just in Paris, but everywhere in the world, is communication and getting good information about what's going on. It's also been important, I think, to a lot of Americans to know that their government is still there and that its consulates and embassies around the world are able to help them if and as the case requires. And so it's a great pleasure for me as a 30-year veteran of the Foreign Service myself, and who did, I'm sad to say, only one tour as a consular officer. I know how important it is for people, for Americans overseas, to hear from and to be in contact with their consular staff from time to time and to know what's going on. And so I particularly thank Bob Hannon for agreeing to this session. And I want to pay particular tribute, not just to the Americans, but to all of the people, including locally hired people around the world who work for the U.S. government to fulfill and provide this absolutely vital function. Without you, it would be a lot harder for us to live our lives. And it's a special treat to have the opportunity to introduce Bryan Aggeler, who is the Chargé d'Affaires at or the acting ambassador, for those of you who are not familiar with that term, at the embassy here in Paris. I've known Bryan for a while, not as well personally as I wish I had, but I do know him pretty well, largely because of something that is not part of his official biography. He was a longtime cartoonist for the in-house State magazine, and he brought a particularly droll approach to the Foreign Service that combined, I would say, the best elements of Dilbert and The Far Side. And it was something that a lot of us really appreciated and really helped us to deal with the stresses and strains of our daily lives, because having a chuckle about the most incredible things that come up is always a relief. But I shouldn't just stress that. I mean, Bryan is a pro. He's been with the State Department for decades. And his service here in Paris follows many years in places like, I think it's now technically called Northern Macedonia, where he was also a deputy chief of mission, Hanoi, Islamabad, Delhi, Chennai, Budapest, Ouagadougou, and yes, Washington, D.C. And as if to underscore that Foreign Service officers don't just live an easy life when they're in places like Paris, I believe I'm correct in saying, Bryan, that you are also, like many of us, dealing with family separation, because I think your wife, who is also a member of the Foreign Service, is in Islamabad. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So, Bryan, thank you so much. I know that you are doing a lot to reach out to the American community these days, and we really appreciate it. So I'll turn it over to you to say a few words. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, William, for that very kind introduction. And good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me? Just want to make sure we're that's the first thing to check, right? And thanks to AARO and AAWE for the opportunity to greet the American community here in Paris. I've been here in Paris since 2017, first serving as political minister counselor and then as deputy chief of mission. And then when Ambassador McCourt's assignment as ambassador ended back in January, I became Chargé d'Affaires, as William said, and will be the chief of mission until the arrival of a new ambassador. And no, we don't have any information yet on who that might be and when they might come. So if any of you have any good rumors to share, I think we'd all be very interested in that. You know, Oscar Wilde once said that when good Americans die, they go to Paris. And without getting into that theological argument, I would just say that we are certainly all aware of the thriving American community here, very much among the living. And I know you've all had interactions with Bob and our terrific consular section, but I also just wanted to express from the top here our embassy's strong interest in the welfare of the American community. The embassy, as you know, serves a great many functions, but one of the most important is the protection of United States citizens abroad. And frankly, we couldn't do that without the support of you all in the American community here. And I know the long and significant history of both AWE and AARO and the role they've played in advocating for overseas Americans in France and throughout the world. And congratulations to AAWE members on the organization's 60th anniversary this year. For the embassy, these organizations have been important partners, enabling us to serve our citizens. And I want to thank you for this cooperation. This event tonight, through the magic of Zoom, is the latest example of that. We look forward to many more years working together and, as William said, someday doing that together in person over a glass of Bordeaux or maybe three. So again, best wishes for a really successful evening. And now I'd like to turn it back to Beth to begin the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bryan, for such a lovely moment. I enjoyed myself immensely, and the evening's just starting. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we introduce Bob Hannon. Any questions that you did send along with your registration have been given to the consular staff, and hopefully those have been integrated into what they will be presenting tonight. In the meantime, during the presentation, if you have other questions to ask, just put them into the chat, and we will try to take as many of those as we can during the question and answer at the end after the presentation. Everyone will remain on mute during the presentation so that there's so that the three people from the embassy can get through their different parts. Now it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Consul General Bob Hannon. I'm not usually with the Consular General and the embassy people, so bear with my nerves. So Bob Hannon is well known to many of you. He's a native of Boston and a graduate of Georgetown University. He has had a long and varied career in the Foreign Service, having previously served in Haiti, Rwanda, India, Russia, Tanzania, and a few years ago in France. We have been grateful and are grateful for his constant accessibility and his assistance to Americans abroad, in particular in participating this evening tonight. Bob?
All right. Thank you very much, Beth, and thank you to AAWE and AARO. I want to offer my personal congratulations on AAWE's 60th anniversary. As Beth mentioned, this is not my first time in Paris. And my last time, I had the great privilege of meeting and working with Phyllis Michaud, and saw firsthand her dynamism. And I'm really still in awe of so much that she achieved, so much that AAWE achieved in changing legislation and really getting real results for Americans overseas. So again, my great appreciation to AAWE for all you do. I want to start, and a lot of you know that I always have my 3-point talking points to start off with, and I want to hit them this time because these are one of the big points that we're often getting questions about, and we just want to get that out there. First, I want to say, please, any information you get tonight, feel free, and I would say feel obligated to disseminate to any other Americans you know in Paris or in France. We constantly trying to get information out. This is an important way of how we serve Americans in France. So the first point is, just to repeat it, and it's been going on for a year, Americans can travel to the United States. About a year ago, many of you remember, there was a mad rush to the airport because it was erroneously reported that the borders to America were being shut and Americans couldn't return home. And we've spent the last year trying to refute that. And we still get questions from people who say, well, can I go back now to the United States? American citizens have always been able to return to the United States. The second thing is, we are open and providing services. Even during the deepest, darkest days of the last lockdown, we were open, issuing emergency passports to Americans. And no matter what happens in the future, the embassy will always be there to issue emergency documentation and to assist Americans. So, and we're waiting, I guess, in the next couple hours to see what will happen with France and the latest lockdown 9 or 10 or whatever we're up to. But even if we do have to cut back on our regular routine services, Americans need to know that if they need a passport, they need to go home, they need the travel document, the embassy will be there and do that. And finally, a personal favorite of mine, please check your passports now. If you can't tell me what the month and year of your passport expiration is, check it. If you're getting close to your passport expiring, renew it now so that you're not facing an emergency at the last minute, rushing into us because your plane leaves at 1 o'clock and it's 9 o'clock in the morning and you're hoping that we can turn around with a passport. We usually can, but it's much easier for us and a lot easier for you if you renew your passports and your family's passports in a timely manner. So now I'd like to introduce the rest of the consular staff, two very important people that I hope you all get to know. First is Jerome Epping, who's the Chief of American Citizen Services. He oversees all the services for American citizens. That includes the passport section, as well as our special citizen services, which is the sexy part of consular work. That's when Americans, we respond to Americans who are in distress. Either they fall sick, they're victims of crime, they get arrested, they become destitute, they're involved in a disaster. Jay and his team are there to respond. And then I'd also like to introduce Eugene Garmise, who is the chief of our passport section. He's the person you probably will most likely come in contact with when you come into the embassy. He and his team are there to renew passports, register the birth of children born to American citizens in France, to perform the full range of notarial acts, to provide all those types of services for you and every American here. So as Beth said, we've received a lot of questions already. We've divided them up. I'm going to go through quickly the questions about visas and travel restrictions. And then Jay will handle the questions about citizen services. And then what this really, the meat of the program will be with Eugene talking about citizenship and transmission of citizenship and all of those issues. And once we get through all the questions that have already been submitted, we'll look very, very much forward to opening the floor and taking any new questions. So with that, the first question is the Consulate in Paris issuing national interest exceptions and travel ban waivers, and what is the approximate timeline? Will the Consul consider requests for senior level executives and managers who work substantially benefits the U.S. economy? Does the work have to be in one of the specific infrastructure sectors identified, or is there a more expansive interpretation for business purposes that can be applied on a case-by-case basis? Let me give you some context for that for a lot of people who don't know what's going on. So remember I said last March, there's reported that America was closing its borders. What was happening is, in response to the pandemic, the president issued a proclamation that suspended travel from persons who were present in Schengen countries for within 14 days of traveling to the United States. American citizens are exempt from that suspension, but just about everybody else is covered by it. And the Secretaries of State and Homeland Security, as provided for in the proclamation, came together and identified certain classes of travel where the benefits to the United States exceeded the risk of further spread of the pandemic. And in those cases, they were issued an exception. It was an exception in the national interest, or a national interest exception, an NIE. And pretty much since last July or so, a big part of what the embassy has been doing is taking requests for these national interest exceptions, and in cases where people are qualified, issuing the exceptions which allow them to travel to the United States. So in answer to the specific concerns of this question, the criteria for the exception is that the travel has to be directly related to supporting a critical infrastructure in the United States. And there is a list of 16 critical infrastructures that the Department of Homeland Security has decided. So no, we do not have any discretion to go beyond that list. Also, the travel has to be directly supporting the infrastructure. So someone going to repair an assembly line so that a food manufacturer can continue producing food, that's considered direct support. A lot of senior level managers and executives aren't meeting that criteria. And unfortunately, we have been unable to grant a lot of those national interest exceptions. Let's see, the next question is, will visitors visas be issued again? And when will the request for residency visas become available again? So these are two big questions. The embassy issues non-immigrant visas, which are basically to go for a short period of time to the United States and then leave the United States and come back home. The most obvious and popular type of visa is the tourist visa, visitor visa, and that is one that is suspended by the presidential proclamation. So we do not have any time frame when that proclamation will be lifted. It has been suspended going on this week. It will be 1 year. And the visitors to the United States has basically gone to zero. And there are very, very few people who are traveling to the United States now. The same for immigrant visas. Most classes of immigrant visas have been suspended for the same reason. So we have a a sizable backlog of immigrant visa cases, which include fiancés of American citizens, that we are constantly looking at once the proclamation, whenever that is lifted, how we're going to quickly respond to that demand for immigrant visas. It's a question about, does it make a difference if someone is vaccinated, whether they can travel to the United States or not? At this time, that is not a factor. What is suspending most travel is the fact that someone is physically present in a Schengen country. I say Schengen country, but that also includes the UK and Ireland. They're all covered. And whether that person's vaccinated or not, has a COVID test or not, has had COVID or not, at this moment. We have no indications if those factors will be considered in the future. Here's a question that's probably more germane to most of the people in the audience. I'm an American and my husband is French. Our son will be leaving Paris to study in Boston in August. That's a good choice. And after dropping him off, we would like to stay in New England until January before returning to Paris. What are the visa possibilities for my husband so that he can live in the U.S. for 5 months? So when I said that American citizens were exempt from the travel proclamation and can travel at any time, also exempt from the proclamation are spouses of United States citizens and parents of minor United States citizens. So if someone has a child in the United States, a spouse in the United States, or a spouse in France who's an American, or a child in France who's an American, they can travel and are not subject to the proclamation. So in this particular case, because the French citizen is looking to stay for 5 months, they would need a tourist visa. They would go online to our system, make an application. They will see that right now our first open appointments are probably in September because there's a backlog of so many people we have not been able to process. They should choose that appointment. Then in our system, there's a expedite function. Use that expedite function to request an earlier appointment and state in the request that I am the spouse of an American citizen. And seeing that that's someone we can actually issue a visa to, we will do our best to pull that appointment forward. Probably we're talking like a week or two out, interview that person. If they're otherwise eligible for the visa, issue the visa. And then when they travel to the United States, they need to show their marriage certificate and either the U.S. spouse or a scan of the U.S. passport. Kind of a different take on this is current restrictions to travel to the U.S. Is it possible for my French partner to travel with me to the United States for my daughter's high school graduation weekend? When we say spouse, that is a very strict meaning. It means a full and complete marriage. So if you say partner, my next question is, do you mean a married spouse? Non-married partners, even in a PAX or some type of civil union, do not meet this criteria, and they are. So in this case, if the French partner is unmarried to the American citizen and is not the parent of the graduating high school student, then the partner would be unable to travel for the graduation, unfortunately. And we have many, many such scenarios of people who, very understandable reasons to travel, but for a variety of family reasons, but at this time are unable to travel. There are certain humanitarian exceptions. They're very, very limited. And at this time, I want to put in the chat the email address to send for any excuse me, I'm trying to work the Zoom screen here. But for any visa questions, you can use this email address. It's parisvisainquiry@state.gov. And there we go. And you should all see it in the chat right now. And as we go through, I'll be putting more and more references and links and email addresses into the chat. So please feel free to copy those down and use them as you need. And that is our final visa question. So again, at the end of the presentation, I'll be happy to take any more. But really, if individual questions, Paris Visa Inquiry is your one-stop email. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Jay Epping, and he will handle the Special Citizen Services questions we received. Take it away, Jay.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to virtually meet you. Don't have quite as many special citizen questions as we did visa questions, so let's get to it. The first one is, as a U.S. citizen living in France who wants to be buried in Wisconsin, if I were to die during the pandemic but not due to it, would there be special procedures to be followed for returning my body to the U.S. beyond those outlined in the embassy's website? The answer is no. No special procedures are required. Even if you died of COVID, there's a good possibility you could be repatriated to the U.S., but in that case, you could not be embalmed without special, and the shipment would require special permission from the CDC, so it's not a given. But if you die of anything other than COVID, you can return to the U.S. You should be able to be embalmed. I had my staff actually look into that the other day when the question came in, and that officially you can be. Some of the funeral homes are reluctant to do it, but other than that, no special procedures are required. The next question we received is, can I travel back to France from the U.S. with a titre de séjour? And right now, it's hard to say. In general, you have to meet all the French requirements, all the French restrictions, as well as, I believe the U.S. aren't any restrictions right now. We heard that they may be making and may have made already some changes last week for French citizens, but that doesn't apply to the carte de séjour folks that we've been able to see to this point. But keep in mind that every traveler coming from the U.S. or most countries outside of the European area, as expanded last week, you have to meet several requirements. The first is the health requirement. Every traveler from the U.S., regardless of their citizenship, so even French citizens, have to have a negative COVID PCR test performed within 72 hours before boarding. That can sometimes be difficult to find in the U.S., although I'm told it's getting easier. The French also, coming in from the U.S., French or American, whomever you are, you have to do a 1 week self-isolation period when you get back to France, and then another PCR test after that. You will sign the statement on your honor that you are going to do that. The current attestation forms then combine the other two types of restrictions. So you still have to be what the French consider an essential traveler. So a citizen of France, a long-term resident of France, a student on a student visa, and other accessible long-term travelers. But you also now have to have a compelling reason, a motif impérieux for your travel to come back into France. Right now, just going to travel to the U.S. to visit family does not count as a compelling reason, a motif impérieux. We have had the question of whether going to get your COVID vaccine qualifies. One kind American, when we said we don't know, please ask the French embassy, kindly shared the response from the French embassy, which said very clearly no, it is not a compelling reason. So if you go just to get the COVID vaccine, you may not be allowed back into France. So the answer to the question, can you travel back with just the carte de séjour, depends on the reasons for your travel and making sure you meet all the current French requirements. As we all know, they can change, and they do change frequently, and for all I know, they're changing them during the Prime Minister's talks right now. I certainly hope not. Unless I'm making them easier for you guys. The next question. I have both French and American nationalities. I came back to France in December of 2020 under my French passport, but now, with restrictions on French citizens leaving the country except for motif impérieux, I cannot leave to go back to the U.S. I wish to return there for 2 months for personal reasons. Can I leave France on my American passport in April and then come back again in June with a French passport? In other words, can one juggle passports around? I'm going to answer the last line of that first. As a general matter, when you enter and leave the U.S. as U.S. citizens, you have to use your U.S. passport, and generally coming into France as a French citizen, you're going to use your French passport. From that standpoint, yes, you can, should, and often need to juggle passports, leaving with, and entering with one and then coming back with a different one. But in the current circumstance, and getting into the larger part of the question, that is, if you meet the motif impérieux, and I know that they said they were going to expand that for certain French citizens, then yes, you could. But you would need to leave on your French passport at that point, probably, or else so that you could show that you had a motif impérieux. If you leave on your American passport, you can always leave on it. On the attestation to leave, there are 4 categories. The first 3 are compelling reason categories, and the fourth is as someone returning to the country of citizenship or country of residence. An American citizen can always leave on that 4th category. However, at the attestation stage, you might not be allowed back in because you haven't shown a compelling reason. We hadn't seen a lot of issues with that until this week. We've gotten a few questions from people who've had difficulty leaving this week on their American passport because they were French residents or dual French nationals, and the French said, well, you can't use that category, or you have residency in France, so if you use that category, we're going to take your carte de séjour at the airport. We are looking into those this week. We had one on, I think, Tuesday, and the other 2 have come in the last 24 hours. So we're still digging into that. But as a practical matter, and we are committed to ensuring that every American who wants to leave France can do so on a U.S. passport. Doesn't mean you'll be able to get back to France when you do. If you give them your carte de séjour, and it's in their rights to take that, if they insist, you might have trouble getting back in. The next question is concerned about banking with U.S. financial institutions, having to cover up that we live in France, difficulty having access to our own funds. I really wish we could help you, because then we could help ourselves. We have the same issues you do. Last week, the day before I got the question, I was up until midnight with my bank in the U.S. trying to convince them that, yes, I actually can transfer money from my U.S. account to my French account, and I'm not doing anything nefarious. And in fact, they sold me the account, promising I could do just that. It still took 2 hours and 4 different agents to get it to happen. It really comes down to, it depends on the bank you're with. You may want to look at other banks. I've heard people, if you have a bank in the U.S., obviously that helps. If you have an address in the U.S., obviously that helps. But talk to friends and neighbors and find a bank that is used to and comfortable dealing with the situation we all find ourselves in. It's unfortunate, but there's unfortunately nothing that we can really do about it at the embassy. At least we would like to. And I have one other question, I believe, that's coming late, and I have not answered service. Military service. Is it still a requirement that our sons register for the U.S. military? What exactly are the consequences if they don't? Refusal of getting a driver's license, not being able to get a government job, etc. So yes, the Selective Service Act still requires all men, not any women, all men ages 18 to 25 to register with selective service. Keep in mind, no draft has been conducted in the U.S. since 1973. And we, as you know, have no compulsory military or national service in the U.S. However, the Selective Service Act does apply to all U.S. citizen men, even if living overseas, and technically even if they've never registered their citizenship. Failure to register can be a criminal offense. I don't think it's prosecuted very often, but it's on the books as a criminal offense. You could be prosecuted. More importantly, it will make that man ineligible for certain U.S. government programs, which includes many federal student loans and an inability to get certain government jobs and jobs requiring a security clearance. So yes, you still have to register. Sometimes there is an issue from overseas registering on the Selective Service system. If your children or grandchildren have an issue, contact us. We can get them the forms and we can help out with that process. And that's the end of my question. So I turn this back to Bob to keep us moving along.
All right, thank you, Jay. And now I'm going to turn it over to Eugene for, as I said, the real meat of the program. Most of the questions were about very complex transmission questions, which I know is very important. I mean, AAWE is so entwined with the whole question about transmitting and retaining American citizenship while living overseas. So I'm going to turn it over to Eugene. A lot of what we're going to do is kind of touch on the big overlying principles, but as Eugene will be saying, in individual cases, really the best thing is to start by email, contacting the passport unit and getting some definitive answers to your specific situation. So with that, Eugene.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for having me here today to speak about these the passport and citizenship issues. Again, my name is Eugene Garmiza. I work with Bob and Jay as the passport chief. So I will launch into the questions that we received prior to this session. I noticed there were some questions posted in the chat room as well, and I will try to field those as well if I haven't answered them by answering the questions that were posed earlier. So let's launch right into it. It's a set of facts. Are my two grandchildren eligible for U.S. citizenship? Their mother was born in the U.S. and is a dual national, but married a French citizen and is a permanent resident in France. The answer is it depends. We would need to know a little bit more to answer this question. Why? Because there are really three different ways that children of U.S. citizens abroad can become or are U.S. citizens. The first one is a child can be a U.S. citizen at birth. That happens if the U.S. citizen parent spent at least 5 years, 2 of which must have occurred after the age of 14, physically present in the United States prior to the birth of the child. And if that is the case, then most likely that child is a U.S. citizen and has been since birth, no matter when that child is documented as a U.S. citizen. They can apply at the embassy for something called the Consul report of birth abroad and the U.S. passport at the same time to be fully documented. If the parent of the mother in this case did not live in the U.S. for the required period of time, then the children are, their children are not U.S. citizens at birth. However, they may be able to acquire U.S. citizenship through the means of essentially expeditious naturalization. One such method is something called, it's under the something called the Childhood Citizenship Act of 2000. And essentially what happens in that situation is that the mother applies for an immigrant visa on behalf of her children. The U.S. citizen mother applies for an immigrant visa on behalf of her children. They move to the United States and they intend to reside, live in the United States. And in that case, after they would acquire U.S. citizenship under this act once they are residing in the United States in the physical custody of their U.S. citizen parent. The second avenue, and this is the avenue that is often referred to as passing citizenship through the grandparents. It's under the INA section 322, which essentially allows a child residing abroad for their parent to apply for a certificate of citizenship, essentially relying on the physical presence, required physical presence of the grandparent. And if that application is approved by the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service, USCIS, then that child can travel to the United States, doesn't have to come on an immigrant visa. They can travel on a visitor visa on their French passport, for example, and can obtain a certificate of citizenship and become a U.S. citizen. Those, in broad strokes, those are the three major ways that a child or a child of a U.S. citizen can become a U.S. citizen. A similar question in the same vein. How can my granddaughter obtain a U.S. passport? Her dad only lived in the U.S. for about 5 years. So there's a lot to unpack there in a small word, about 5 years. According to the U.S. law, in order to become a U.S. citizen of birth, to obtain a consular report of birth abroad, the consular officer must be convinced by something called clear and convincing evidence that the U.S. citizen parent has spent 5 years in the United States, 2 of which must have occurred after the age of 14 prior to the birth of the child. So in essence, if the closer during the interview, for example, the closer that it seems to a consular officer that period is, it's possible to actually count by days. And officers who, for example, have spent some of their career in the border regions of the United States with Mexico would count hours that the U.S. citizen parent has spent in the United States or back in Mexico in order to arrive at 5 years or 2 years after the age of 14. So during the interview, we would request that the U.S. citizen parent present some sort of proof or to support this claim of 5 years physical presence in the United States. If they are able to demonstrate it by, again, clear and convincing evidence, then the child would be a U.S. citizen of birth and would obtain a consular report of birth. If, however, they are unable to do so, the second and the third avenue that I described earlier would come into play. So I will turn to the next question, which explores the difference between those 2 avenues in a little bit more detail. What is the difference between getting citizenship for a child using Section 320 or 322? And can the consulate refuse to renew the passport of a person who has acquired citizenship by means of one of these sections on the premise that the person does not live in the U.S.? And apparently there's been some reports of such refusals. So let me tackle the first part of that question. The biggest difference is under Section 320, which is the Child Citizenship Act of 2000. The child enters the U.S. With an immigrant visa in the legal and physical custody of a U.S. citizen parent. In that case, the naturalization is automatic, and the child can apply for a U.S. passport without the need for a naturalization certificate or a certificate of citizenship. They can simply apply for a passport once those criteria have been met. Again, and those criteria are the child enters the United States on an immigrant visa to reside in the U.S. in the legal and physical custody of a U.S. citizen parent. On the other hand, under Section 322, which is that grandparent clause that I described earlier, the child would need to be in the U.S. only temporarily and is typically residing outside of the United States in the custody of U.S. citizen parents. In that case, no immigrant visa is needed, and one does not need this intent to reside in the United States, but there needs to be an approved application by USCIS. The application is N600K is the number, and I think we will post some information in the chat with links to USCIS and other useful information where people go to see in a little bit more detail the process that would be involved, and that child can obtain the certificate of citizenship. So in order to obtain that certificate of citizenship, essentially USCIS will rely on the physical presence of the grandparent. And in that case, the child will be considered a naturalized citizen. Again, a lot of these questions repeat essentially the same, some some variation of these questions. We are naturalized Americans. Our two children are US born, but did not spend 2 years in the US after they turned 14, both married foreign spouses. How do we start the process of getting American citizenship for our grandchildren who were not born in the US? And does it make any difference that we are naturalized? Speaking as a naturalized US citizen, no, it does not make a difference. I can be president. However, that is the only difference that I can think of. Generally, as I mentioned, if the parents do not have enough time to transmit citizenship, the grandparents may be able to do so under this expeditious naturalization process through USCIS that I described earlier. This is an interesting question. So children, if the child of one American parent and a non-American was born in Switzerland, but the family now lives in Italy, does the American parent need to go to Bern to present proof of US residence for citizenship for the child under the consular report of birth abroad process? Or can they apply at the nearest consulate in their country of residence? That's a great question. So generally, the consular report of birth abroad must be issued by the consular section in the consular district where the child was born. But as a matter of convenience, other consular sections or embassies in embassies in countries where the people are currently residing, in the case of this question, Italy, they can accept the forms and payments and will pass all the documentation to the consular section with jurisdiction over the place of birth of the child. So in this case, the consular section in Italy would accept all the documents, would accept payment, and will send the documents to Switzerland to our embassy in Switzerland for adjudication, for final adjudication. Generally, the consular section in the country which has jurisdiction over the place of birth will not require the parents to travel back for an interview. In theory, it can happen if there are some outstanding questions necessary that must be answered in order to resolve the application. I can say that in my career, I've never experienced where we have required folks to travel to another country. A lot of these questions, even if they do arise, can be resolved frankly remotely. However, it is possible, but rare. So I will continue. In a little bit more detail about this grandfather clause. So what are the conditions for naturalization of children under Section 320? So this is under the Childhood Citizenship Act. This is the section where the child must obtain an immigrant visa prior to naturalizing. And under this section of the INA, again, Section 320, or the Childhood Citizenship Act, it essentially automatically naturalizes a child who is under the age of 18 with at least one U.S. citizen parent when that child enters the United States with an immigrant visa and with the intent to reside in the United States in the physical and legal custody of a U.S. citizen parent. So think of it as check marks. So you have these 6 check marks, and as life of the child continues on, and once those 6 check marks are all filled up, then that child can claim U.S. citizenship and can apply for a passport. So again, under the age of 18, at least one U.S. citizen parent, child enters the United States with an immigrant visa, intent to reside in the United States in the physical and legal custody of a U.S. citizen parent. I will now answer the question that I think I disregarded, which was asked: Can the consulate refuse to renew a passport of a person who has acquired citizenship by means of either Section 320 or Section 322. Essentially, refuse to renew is a loaded term. If in the rare instance where a consular officer who is renewing the passport of a child who was granted citizenship under these two categories, finds some additional information that demonstrates that citizenship was granted erroneously under those sections in the first place, theoretically, it is possible that that passport application may be denied. However, if the original decision was not faulty in any way, was not produced by fraud or then there's no difference in how that child as a U.S. citizen is treated going forward compared to citizens that were born in the United States who became naturalized citizens like myself, who took an oath, or by children who were born abroad to U.S. citizen parents who gained citizenship in that way. Essentially, once all of the requirements of those two sections have been met, if the application was properly filed with USCIS and approved, then there should not be anything to prohibit that child's parents and that child, when that child becomes an adult, from renewing their passport and living their full life as fully documented U.S. citizens. And those are really the bulk of the questions that I saw that we have received prior to the chat. I saw a couple of questions, for example, in the chat room. For example, there was one, my daughter wants to pass on her U.S. citizenship to her baby who will be born sometime this year. Was born in France. She was born in France to U.S. American mother and a French father. She has to have spent 5 years in the U.S. How are her 4 years in a U.S. university counted? That's 4 years, 9 months times 4, 36 months, 3 years. Again, this really depends on the actual circumstances of one's attendance of college, for example, and this will be determined during the interview. If we are looking as consular officers when we look at these cases, we are really looking at what was the physical presence. There is no regulation or law that states that I must take a transcript of somebody who went to a completed 4 years bachelor's, and I must count those 4 years as 36 months. We are looking at people's patterns of life. Some folks leave the campus, some work during the summer, some go home to France, some travel the United States. It really does depend on the particular situation of the applicant, of the U.S. citizen parents. So I will encourage those with very, very specific questions to reach out to us at the embassy. We will post our contact information. We have a couple of email addresses that can be used to contact us, and we also have some online resources that will be posted. That you can study to answer these questions in a little bit more detail. Okay, so I see. So through USCIS using the same form N600K as is used for grandparent citizenship. Okay, this is somebody who's giving a little bit more information. And somebody asked, what is the email to contact our section? And I think Bob will post that shortly. Let's see if I missed some questions. Okay, Eugene, is there a minimum amount of time that the child must live in the U.S. Before getting naturalized? So again, this depends on the under the Childhood Citizenship Act, which is when the child comes in on an immigrant visa. There is no prescribed period of time. There must be an intent to reside in the United States, but there's no specific amount of time that is outlined in the legislation how long the child must reside in physical and legal custody in the U.S. With the U.S. citizen parent in the United States. Okay. How about Americans who adopt children but do not reside in the U.S.? Can the child get U.S. citizenship? So I think the Childhood Citizenship Act is also applicable to adopted children of U.S. citizens, so yes, the answer is yes. They would. One can get an immigrant visa to travel to the United States and can become naturalized under the Childhood Citizenship Act of 2000. Okay, how detailed does the evidence have to be to pass on U.S. citizenship to prove the 5 years? A U.S. college diploma and MBA diploma, would that work? Again, that really does depend on the particulars of the case. If, for example, during the interview, I'm speaking to somebody who has spent a lot of time in the U.S., but the only proof that they have brought is evidence of their, for example, evidence of their U.S. college education and MBA, then I suspect that will be sufficient because it confirms the general impression of the interview. However, if U.S. college and MBA studies were apparently the only times that the person has spent in the United States, then I must say that we'll probably dig a little bit deeper to see again how long each trip to the U.S. was. What was their mode of life at the time that they were attending the university or attending their graduate program. So it really does depend on the particulars of the case. Let's see. Okay. So we have a couple of questions that, let's see. Detailed evidence. We have a question about a green card. I'm not sure if Bob, you would like to field that question. To get a green card, how long one must live in the U.S. first in order to get a green card. I suspect, from what I understand, once a person comes in on an immigrant visa, an application for a green card is made at the port of entry. For again, green card is a legal residency. So I think that's what happens. Okay, what constitutes residence needed to satisfy the conditions of Section 320? It's hard to say. Residence is residence. There needs to be an intent to reside in the United States, and it needs to be something more than temporary stay in the United States. It's an intent to live, reside in the United States. So I think I've covered most of it, and I will turn it over to, there is one question, one big question that I haven't answered, which was posed, and it's a question about our renunciation services currently, which are currently suspended. So the question was, when is it anticipated that the embassy in Paris will again able to adjudicate expatriation or renunciation of U.S. citizenship for dual national resident in France? So generally, the embassy has had to because of the pandemic, has had to suspend renunciation services. The reason why is because we have to prioritize between different services for U.S. citizens. And as Bob was describing, the sort of services that we are prioritizing, which is documentation of U.S. citizens abroad and provision of essential special citizenship services. And the department and we have made the decision that simply put, the renunciation of citizenship is frankly a lower priority services than the services that I just mentioned. It is also happens to be one of our most time-consuming and staff-consuming. We are now, because of the desire to limit the exposure of our staff, we're operating with, frankly, skeleton crews. So a decision has been made to essentially suspend those services. When we can resume to provide them, that really depends on the pandemic. We really hope that the situation here, the health situation in France, improves quickly to allow us to offer all of our services at our normal capacity. But right now, we are unable to provide that service, again, based on the reasons that I just stated. And with that, I will turn it over to Bob.
All right. Thank you, Eugene. Yeah, there's a lot of information, and I put a lot of the contact and the reference links on there about different passport and citizenship services. I didn't see actually the passport. So Eugene, if you can put the passport email in the chat for people so
Sure.
they can see it. I know looking through, there's just one question, and I'll impinge on Eugene's territory, where it says, how do I prove residence or physical presence in the United States? Are boarding passes good? And this question, because when I was working with Phyllis Michaud, we came up with an answer, and it was called a shoebox. And anytime a child was in the United States, put the evidence in the shoebox. So boarding passes, old passports. If the child went to summer camp and did an 8-week course and has a little rawhide certificate, put that in. If they attended any school in the United States, throw that in. Anytime they put in the United States, it's all cumulative and it all adds up. So the idea is that many years later, when the child is of childbearing age, him or herself, and that you need to prove this physical presence, you have this box overflowing with all different types of documents. And if you never have to do it, you have a great box of memorabilia, but it can really come in handy because, as Eugene said, we look at every case, and there are actually cases we have sat down easily counting the number of days. We've gone down to counting the number of hours spent in the United States to try to get to that 5 years of physical presence, 2 of which after the age of 14, to enable someone to transmit citizenship to the next generation. So that question really brought back a lot of memories for me. I want to go through quickly and answer some of the visa questions, travel questions that have come up. And then there are a lot of questions about U.S. citizens, can they come back into France? And thankfully, that's going to be Jay's bailiwick to answer. So there's one question about if the proclamation is lifted and we can start processing the K-1 fiancé visas again, how would that be affected by the lockdown? Which is a great question and leads a much bigger important question. What will happen during the lockdown? And as a good bureaucrat, my answer is, well, it depends. Back in March, last March, a year ago, when there was a complete lockdown, the consular section locked down, closed down everything except, as I said, emergency passports. So Americans who needed emergency passports could still come in and get those passports. Americans who needed other emergency services provided by Jay's team could get those services. But otherwise, for normal renewals of passports, almost all visa processing, we were not operating. We really didn't start up again until July, the end of July. In October, when we had the next lockdown, there was a specific attestation, be out and about, to attend a meeting with public services. And we took that to mean if you were coming for your passport appointment or your visa appointment, that would be allowed. So we kept open during the October lockdown. We'll have to see if there's a lockdown and how it pertains and how complete it is. If it's a complete lockdown, no one on the streets the way it was last March, we will probably be shut down for both visa services and normal passport services. But I hasten to add, we will have at least a skeleton staff at the embassy able to print and provide emergency passports for American citizens, and a staff to respond to emergency questions from American citizens. So even the deepest, darkest lockdown, we will be there to provide those emergency services. For others, especially visas, we will just have to deal and wait until we can open up again, and then try to provide as many, catch up with the backlog as best we can. Question often comes up, if someone has is in the Schengen country, a Schengen country, and this is, I want to say, is not nationality based. So it's not that French citizens are not allowed to travel to the United States. It's anybody in France. So a French citizen in Japan can travel to the United States now without any worry about the proclamation. A Japanese citizen in France cannot travel because they are present in a Schengen country and so are subject to the proclamation. The question is, can someone fly to a third country and then enter the United States? Yes, in theory, and some people are actually doing this. The kicker is you have to spend 14 days in that third country before you enter the United States. In other words, you need to quarantine and get rid of all your Schengenness, if that's a word, before you can enter the United States. And it's further complicated because a lot of other countries have their own travel restrictions. For example, Canada, I think it's just as hard to get into Canada. And then to travel from Canada to the United States, it's even harder. A lot of people I know are going to Mexico. You can fly from Mexico to the United States, but you can't cross the land border right now, if I understand correctly. When you go to board the flight from Mexico City, however, you will have to prove that you have been outside a Schengen country or the UK or Brazil, China, South Africa, or Iran for at least 14 days. And then finally, it asks about French citizens departing France. In other words, so my French spouse can travel to the United States, but France may not let him leave France. Unfortunately, as Jay said, we are hearing that even French citizens have to show not only to leave France, but to return to France, that they have the motif impérieux. And that is something we as the American Embassy do not play a role in. Our concern is that American citizens can return to the United States, and if an American citizen is stopped from returning, we will get involved and intervene. But as far as anybody entering France, that is, as a sovereign country, France has sole jurisdiction over that question, and we have no standing to intervene in that. So I think that's all the visa questions, travel questions I saw, at least while I was talking. And
Bob,
so,
there was a question about what are the prospects for COVID passport system to be established?
Yeah,
With
I'm sorry. As I said in my opening, we don't have any indication of that. I've heard nothing, and I really don't think anybody in the United States government, at least, is even thinking about it at this point. I should add that for the Biden administration, the objective is ending the pandemic, and that's at all costs, and getting people vaccinated. The last time I looked, about 12% of the American population has been fully vaccinated. That will probably have to be much higher, 3 or 4 times that, before anybody starts really thinking about any type of vaccine passport or something like that. That's just my idea. I have no inside information, so please don't quote me. But we have no information, and I would be surprised if anything comes out anytime soon, at least for travel to the United States, for any type of vaccine passport. I know, is there any other questions about, I'm just looking through the chat, anything else about?
Possible, is it for a family living near Lille, is it possible to renew a minor's passport without coming?
Well, I'll steal this from Eugene because it's a quick answer. We have to see, by law, have to see every child under the age of 16, as well as have both parents sign in our presence authorizing the issuance of the passport. So unfortunately, yes, families from Lille, from Bordeaux, from all over France have to come into either Paris or Marseille to renew a child's passport in person. There's a question, can you fly to Mexico for 2 weeks and then go to France? My understanding is the French restrictions are pretty universal. They have identified, Jay, is it 6 or 7 countries now where you don't need that, but I believe Mexico is still on that list. So it's very difficult to get around the French restrictions. And then I see the Prime Minister's just announced a full lockdown, so thank you for that news. We'll be checking and have to see. It's as many of the questions tonight, a lot of it's in the details, and we have to see how that's going. And Eugene has posted the email addresses, passportsparis@state.gov, and CRBA, which is Consular Report of Birth Abroad, Paris@state.gov.
I had an outside question.
Sure.
Proof of prior residence in the United States for a child born abroad. If in a family, the older siblings have already gotten their passport at birth because the parents demonstrated that they'd had the 5 years, for a subsequent child, do they have to go through the whole process, or has the State Department kept that evidence of prior residence?
I'll happily let Eugene take that question.
Our regulations do allow to essentially take if the circumstances of the birth of the older siblings were similar to those of a younger sibling. They were both born to the same parents. The parents were the transmitting parent, as we say, it was a U.S. citizen time of birth. Then it's up to the discretion of the consular officer, but for the most part, I think they can take the evidence of the older children's documentation as a U.S. citizen to essentially use that for satisfying the physical presence requirement. So that's a long way of saying it helps a lot, and they should definitely bring proof of that documentation to their interview.
Okay. Thank you. And Jay, I don't know if you saw any more citizen services questions.
There were a couple. Yeah. One is, what can you tell us about the ability of dual national travel between the U.S. and France in the coming future and this summer? As we said before, from the U.S. side, that's not an issue, so as long as you meet the COVID testing requirement under the current rules. From the French side, while we will fight to say you're a U.S. citizen, you can return to the U.S., that doesn't mean that you'll be able to come back into France. France is, from everything we can see, very serious that a French citizen needs to show that compelling reason. For a dual citizen to get out right now, the dual citizens should be prepared to show their residence in the U.S., or they will have a fight sometimes getting out of France, just based on what we've seen this week. So from the American side, no issues. From the French side, if you can't show the compelling reason, you're going to face some challenges most likely. Another question, if U.S. citizens with French residency travel to the U.S. for family reasons and gain entry back to France without a problem, that's the same thing. You're going to have to show the compelling reason to get back into France. You can fight to get out of France, and you should be allowed out of France. They may threaten to take your carte de séjour or may actually take it. But you can get to the U.S. It's getting back into France. You're going to have to follow the French rules on that. Bob answered the one about going to a non-Schengen country. Give me 1 second to scan through. Someone said, so if I understand correctly, my French spouse can visit me and our 3 boys, but as a French citizen, he can't leave France because he doesn't have a motif impérieux. Correct. That's the way we read the rules, and that's the way that they seem to be enforcing them in Charles de Gaulle, unfortunately. The next question was very similar. Can those of us who have an American passport or card de resident travel within the EU and come back to France without any problems? Subject to any changes they may have announced tonight. Right now, going into tonight, that travel within what they call the European area, which was basically the other Schengen countries, now includes the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and I think someplace else. Basically, there are very few restrictions other than you need to have a negative COVID test within 72 hours of your travel back to France. Nope. Green card question. Sorry, hold on.
There's a question about the obligation to make a report of birth to a child in France, child born abroad. Is it necessary? That's the question.
It's Eugene's question, but I'll go ahead and answer it. So if the parent qualifies to transmit citizenship, that child is a U.S. citizen. Whether you go back and register the child or not, the child is a U.S. citizen, so the child actually can't naturalize because that's saying you aren't a U.S. citizen and become one. So you should go ahead and register the birth. Plus, it's a lot faster and a lot cheaper to register the birth abroad than go through the immigrant visa and naturalization process. I think based on the current, what USCIS is charging for naturalization proceedings, it's probably a tenth of the cost or less than naturalization.
And if I could just weigh in, Jay, on that, and this is a kind of important point. The Supreme Court has held that citizenship is a constitutional right. So if someone is applying to travel to the United States, applying to get a visa or ESTA, and there's any possibility that they have a claim to American citizenship, that has to be adjudicated first. So we cannot just issue a visa to someone and they say, oh, we'll work it out in the States. No, we have to adjudicate their whole citizenship first.
Another question, can an American citizen young child travel to the U.S. with their Ukrainian mother? I guess, Bob, this is probably more yours because it's more of an NIE question, but go ahead.
Yeah, I would say it's not so much a question, can the child travel with the mother, but really the mother can travel with the child, because thanks to if it's a minor U.S. child, then a parent can travel with the child. So the child will be calling the shots on that trip.
Okay, another question about a carte de séjour holder re-entering France after a trip to the US. That's the same answer. You have to meet the compelling requirement. Could you please post an email address for questions concerning the selective service requirement? You can write to citizeninfo@state.gov, and Bob also posted some links with selective service information that you can look at. Those links are also available on our website. And these are the new questions I hadn't looked at yet. For students with dual nationality, is a stage and motif impérieux for leaving and returning to France. It was originally, I believe, depending on how it was classified. I don't know. I have to look into that one again. I'm not sure. I know they tightened down on the students and that sort of training in one of the prior updates back in the beginning of March, I think. And I haven't looked at that. I haven't had to look at that question, so I don't know the answer to that one. Where can we find the French rules? So Bob put that information in the chat as well, but the Ministry of Interior website, if you go to the welcome page, there'll be the links to the attestation forms. You can click there and see the forms, and that actually has what are the rules, what are the compelling reasons. The French Ministry of Foreign Affairs website has information in English with links to the forms and answers some questions. You can get to that directly through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website or through the French Embassy in Washington. Today they had a link to that on their homepage, and that's the easiest way to find that information. And it seems, looking at it, it's the same in English as in French when I've compared the two. Silly but practical question, can U.S. citizens travel back to the U.S. with their pets? Are there any quarantine protocols in place in light of the pandemic? From the U.S. government side, no, the rules are the same. The airlines, on the other hand, have really cut down and tightened up pet travel right now. If people trying to transit through Charles de Gaulle cannot transit with, or pets cannot transit through Charles de Gaulle right now, is what we're being told by people, often other foreign service officers who are trying to get back to the U.S. So you really have to check with your airline on that. But from the U.S. government side, there's no restriction, but most airlines have. I see someone put the link to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, diplomatie.gouv.fr is a good source. You say they will take the carte to CDG if we try to travel. What do you mean by carte? I'm sorry, the carte de séjour. We have seen, before this week, one case, this week, two cases where people have been told that if they insisted on traveling back to the U.S. under the provision that they're a U.S. citizen or resident in the U.S., then French immigration will essentially consider you no longer a resident in France and will tell you you have to turn in your carte de séjour. One person turned it in and has not tried to return to France as far as we know. The two other people declined to turn it in and reached out to us, and we're reaching back to them and saying, unfortunately, the French are legally able to do this.
I should point out that that's based on our anecdotal evidence.
Yes.
Like Jay said, we've had 3 cases now. We suspect, and this is not formal embassy guidance, that it really depends on who's manning the immigration desk, because we know a lot of people are traveling to the United States, a lot of people are traveling back from the United States, and so I would not say that it is policy that everybody who's leaving will have their carte titre de séjour taken, but we have known of certain circumstances where that's happened or been threatened.
And to give some additional context, there are around 6 flights a day back to the U.S., a lot of those with people with carte de séjour, and we've only had 3 complaints. So it certainly does not seem common. 2 of the complaints seem to have come from the same day from people getting on the same flight. It does seem to be somewhat specific on who's on duty at immigration at the time. We have several questions about the quarantine requirement upon arrival in the U.S. So the CDC calls for a 7-day quarantine and a new COVID test between the 3rd and 5th day after your arrival in the U.S. States can impose a stricter requirements if they choose to. New York State has had a very strict requirement. So what we recommend is follow the CDC guidelines, but you should also check the State Department of Health for the state that's your final destination. You can generally just Google, like, say, Colorado State Department of Health, and go to their COVID information and look for information for travelers. That's where they post that sort of information. Not every state, at this point, I'm not even sure most states have a quarantine requirement outside of the CDC guidelines, but some do. By the way, CDC also says if you don't retest between 3 and 5 days, the self-isolation period should be 10 days. The Consul d'Etat, this is new to me. The Consul d'Etat ruled that the rules establishing the motif impérieux are indicative Anyone planning to challenge what is written needs to be prepared to argue with immigration at CDG. Anecdotal information is critical to call a supervisor at the discussion and stay cool. I haven't seen the Conseil d'Etat ruling, but I would say the call for a supervisor and stay cool. Yes, when I visited with the immigration folks at CDG, they say if you're cool and polite, you get a lot farther with them than if you start getting angry. As soon as you start yelling at them, their inclination to help you goes right out the window. So it's always a good idea to stay cool with immigration anywhere. And that seems to be all of them. Oh, and I forgot to mention, previously we did have a couple of questions about Social Security, getting Social Security numbers, a question about retirement. So while Social Security falls on paper under the American Citizen Services Unit, it is actually staffed by employees of the Social Security Administration, and they don't report directly to us. With their COVID mitigation strategies, they're doing everything right now by email. They're not taking in-person appointments, and they are not staffed to take phone calls. So Bob posted before, and we'll post again, the email address for them. There is also information that Bob posted, links on our website with information and frequently asked questions to respond to some of the questions. But you're going to have to go directly to Social Security with those questions. We don't actually have good answers to give you right now. You have to get the information from Social Security, from our federal benefits unit.
And there's a question about, is there an IRS office in Paris? Unfortunately not. The IRS office closed, I think it's going on 10 years now, maybe a little longer. That's unfortunately a decision by the United States Treasury, and I think they've closed all their overseas offices.
Yeah.
It's something that we see that many of the big American domestic their overseas part is so small that they sometimes feel it's not worth maintaining anymore. Those of us, such as the State Department, which are directly focused on overseas, know the need for those services, and we make that point often, but they've decided otherwise. So right now, our biggest advice for any IRS issues is irs.gov, and from there, use the search function. I know they have a lot of pamphlets and advice on Americans residing overseas and their particular tax situations, but unfortunately, there's nobody at the embassy anymore who can provide any direct assistance. So I know, Kathleen, I don't know if you've seen any or had any of the questions come in.
It's a little bit, the one about quarantine requirements are different for vaccinated people. I guess, official vaccinated people may be vaccinated in the United States and going back there. Is there anything new on that front?
We have, as Jay said, this is very much a state issue. It's one of the many pleasures and benefits of living in a federal system of government, but health issues are really out to the state. I have not heard of any state yet waiving the quarantine or isolation requirements. I believe that no state is mandating them, but they're all basically, or at least based on self compliance. And I haven't heard of any state that is yet just waiving them totally based on vaccination status, but that could be changing. The best thing I advise people to do is to Google the health department, whatever state you're going to be going in, and they will definitely have a COVID banner right on their front page, and follow that about what the latest advice and requirements are for each state that you might be in the United States.
And on the federal level, the CDC guidance right now doesn't distinguish for the self-isolation period whether you've been vaccinated or not. Yeah, so Bob's right. Check with each state. Some states, New York and Hawaii in particular, are very strict about their quarantine requirements.
Well, I've got a request to ask you if you would do another event in a couple of months.
I mean, definitely, we look forward to it. As I said, this is very much in our interest to do these events. We're very happy to work with AARO and AAWE and ACWO and all the other organizations, the American Club. But this is something we do because it's a very efficient use of our time. As I said, if we can answer one question for 100 people, that's much better than answering the same question 100 times. So please, we be happy to do another event if something that's more focused on a specific idea. I mean, I know now this is kind of a catch up because we haven't been able to do this in quite a while.
Yeah.
But you know, something specifically on transmission requirements or specifically on, you know, travel requirements or whatever, we'd be happy to do that.
I'm looking, did you see this question about information for people wanting to come back to France and got their carte de séjour taken away? Should they contact the French Consulate about getting the visa de retour in order to get back in France with an immigration status? That's about, refers to the couple of people that I guess that you had who lost their carte de séjour.
I would, that's totally under the French jurisdiction. I wouldn't even begin to pretend that we had an answer to that. Definitely French embassy, French consulate would be the place to start, but I know their system is so very different from the United States system of immigration. It's really hard for me to say who would be making the decision on anything like that.
Okay. I think you've answered about everything. I wanted to let you know that AARO and AAWE will make a report on this event available. I want to thank our consular officers for being so generous of their time and their advice. And also to thank all of you participants for your support and interest. We'll try to do it again. I think it's very important, especially now, to keep these contacts open and available. And we're very grateful for your availability. So good evening, everyone.
Kathleen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, William. Thank you to the organization. Thank you all for spending this time with us tonight. We look forward to doing this again, either in person or Zoom. I mean, as the top, in a way, these presentations, as much as they have so many difficulties, we might be reaching many more people than if we tried to gather everybody in one room. So we'd certainly look at a hybrid way going forward in the future if, you know, in that great day, whenever it is, the pandemic is declared over and we decide what over means, and we go to what is ever the new post-pandemic situation. So thank you very much, and wish all of you a happy day. Now we all go and read and what exactly does this new lockdown mean for all of us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.